Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to share with you what we think might be the winning formula for equality in research funding in Canada. Now, of course, I'm very, very lucky to be standing here because we currently have a Prime Minister who's a self-declared feminist. Not only is he a feminist, but because it was 2015, as he liked to say, he appointed a gender-balanced cabinet. And the way it works in Canada is that funding for science is directly under the minister's purview. So the health minister, Jane Philpott, is responsible for all funding for health research in Canada through the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, which is where I'm one of the scientific directors, but it's our Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, Minister Duncan, who's directly responsible for funding in social sciences, natural sciences, engineering, and other STEM disciplines. So I'm fortunate that way. I'm also fortunate because I'm funded through health, which is not always the way it is in other countries. I'm actually part of what's called a health portfolio. And in 2009, the health portfolio developed a policy called the Sex and Gender-Based Analysis Policy, or what we call SGBA. And what that requires, if you want to read the policy statement, is that it's a policy that all government organizations in health have to use sex and gender-based analysis to develop, implement, and evaluate the health portfolio's research programs and policies to address the different needs of women and men. So my organization is required yearly by Status of Women Canada to provide a report on how we're doing this. Now, reports, as we'll discuss, are just reports, and sometimes they achieve the desired end and sometimes they don't. But what we realized, if this was passed in 2009, is that in 2010, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and for those of you who don't know, we're kind of like the NIH model, where there's 13 different institutes and each institute represents a topic. And again, because of the foresight of some very strong female advocates in Canada, there's actually an Institute of Gender and Health, which means that I hold the same budget and the same voice at the table as the Cancer Institute, which is usually very powerful, or, I don't know which other one here is powerful, but clearly there's sort of a rank in other organizations because of how many players and researchers there are in each field, what kind of voice you have. In any case, as the scientific director of the Gender and Health Institute, I'm an advocate for SGBA, as we call it. And we tend to divide that, and this is important, into gender equality issues in science, as well as sex and gender in science issues. And the way I define this is that we try to separate it out into, well, who's getting the funding? And obviously we measure that by whether you check off if you're male or female on the application, but also who's being studied. So are taxpayers funding research that truly benefits boys, girls, men, women, and gender diverse people equally? And I'll tell you a little bit about how we're measuring that. And this is a conceptual difference in North America in terms of dividing it like that, because I think in Europe it's always called the gender dimension. And when we talk about gender and we talk about measure, sometimes I think well, from a scientific perspective, it's easier for me to divide it up into these kind of variables. Let's start with the gender equality issue. So here the question is, well, who's receiving research funding in Canada? And we look back from 2000 to 2015, and I'm going to let you guess what proportion of people who get funding, scientists in Canada who get funding, are male. Give me, pretend we're really good. Somebody say 50%. Anyone? 80? Okay, well, we're not that bad, but we're right in the middle of the global statistics that I heard this morning from our speaker from UNESCO. 72% male, 28% women. Why? That's really the question for scientists, right? So what are the hypotheses? And we heard a little bit. One possibility is that it's a problem within the research funding organization and there's gender bias. The other possibility is just there's more men out there, and as many people like to say around my table, well, there's nothing you could do about it if there's no female professors. So who thinks It's gender bias. Let me read the question and we'll take another vote. Given equal numbers of male and female applicants for research funding, do you think female researchers are less likely to be successfully funded by research granting agencies? Raise your hand if you think yes. Raise your hand if you think no. Let's dig into this hypothesis a little further. So if the majority of you said yes, then what's the hypothesis here? I told you that we divide things into sex and gender. That might have startled some of you, especially if you're not from North America. And especially in health, don't forget I'm a health research funding organization, we like to differentiate between sex being the inherent biological characteristics that differentiate males from females. So this would be your genes or your sex hormones, from the gender, or what we call socially constructed roles, norms, and behaviors, and these are definitions put out by the Institute of Medicine. Now, do you think there's a genetic explanation for why females should be producing poorer quality science? No. If anything, it should probably be the opposite. Who here knew that women have 2 X chromosomes and men have what? 1 X chromosome and a little Y chromosome. Did you know that the Y chromosome is only 1/4 of the size, actually, of the X chromosome, and it has only 1/4 of the amount of genes on it? But anyway, I won't talk about size. Size may or may not matter. But yeah, right. So we would think that it would be more gender, correct? So the answer is, it depends. So it depends what type of funding competition you're looking at, whether women and men have equal success rates or differential success rates. Because when you look at what we call our project grants, where the reviewers are asked to evaluate the idea, the hypothesis, the methods, the analysis, whether the program will have impact, women and men have the same success rates. However, in the types of competition where you ask the reviewers to evaluate the person submitting the grant, then we start to see big differences because they're asked to evaluate the leadership criteria and the track record of the individual who submitted the idea. And this is where, through analysis, we found some interesting things that we've been able to work on. So I want to give you 2 examples of grants, both within our organization, but also combined. I took the Canada Research Chair Program, which are research chairs given to both health, social, and engineering and technology science to show how this plays out in reality. So let me talk first about what we call our CIHR Foundation grants. The Foundation grant was a visionary grant. We put it into place maybe 3 years ago, where we said, you know what, if you've been applying every year your whole life for grants and most of the time you've gotten them and you're producing, then why don't we save you the time of submitting grants and just give you 7 years funding, and we trust that you're going to continue to have good ideas, and instead of spending your time writing grants, you could actually be spending your time doing the science. So yes, very visionary, right? So we put that in place 3 years ago. The second example I'm going to give you, and that's investigator initiated. And here I'm going to talk about the difference, right? Because the investigator decides if they're going to apply for it. The second type of grant where leadership ended up being important is when the university submitted professors or scientists' names for chairs. So these are research chairs that the university gets that can then be used to attract or retain professors at the university. So let's go through them quickly. I know we started a little bit late. I'll try to rush here. So the foundation grant, essentially, 3 years ago when we put it into place, and for 2 years in a row, we found that in blue, you see the proportion of applications submitted. Here at the bottom for women, and we have other equity variables that we look at in Canada. Of course, only 28% of applicants were female because that's what happens in Canada. But look how many were funded. There was only a 50% success rate, but if they have the same ideas, that should not be happening. So what did we do to stop what we considered was gender bias in science funding? Well, we made a strategy and an equity framework. And it was really amazing to me that once we got everything down in writing and we got it improved by our governing council, how quickly things happen. And one of my lessons learned that I'll talk about in the panel discussion right before lunch is how come things didn't happen quicker and how important it is to really institutionalize these types of actions. So we wanted to eliminate the systemic bias, and one of the first actions that we did was to, as we've heard, make people aware of their biases and make it a mandatory requirement for peer reviewers on these competitions to complete an unconscious bias module. And we implemented this for last year's competition. This is what the bias and peer review module looks like. It's an online training module. I actually brought some handouts. They're bilingual, by the way, which I'll leave here at the end of my talk. And we decided to try to inform our module by best evidence, so we did a scoping review, and I would encourage you to read the publication that came out this year. But bottom line is, there has not been a lot of research, absolutely no randomized clinical trials, looking at the effectiveness of interventions in peer review for research funding organizations to decrease unconscious bias. What we found is that erasing people's names and taking out he and she in the application makes absolutely no difference. That was a pre-post study by Levin, who may be in the room, and if so, congratulations on that study. What we did find, though, is that language is so important in these leadership evaluations, and that there's clear differences by which reference letters and even the way women describe themselves and men describe themselves that come out in the application. So, for instance, this was a study looking at reference letters. When you nominate someone for a chair, the letters for females are shorter, less focused on accomplishments, use more gendered term like very collaborative and very helpful and extremely nurturing to others in the lab. So we consider those gender terms, more grindstone adjectives. Grindstone adjectives are hardworking, pushes through with difficulty, puts in many hours, so very grindstone. And this, of course, is in comparison to the letters written for males that say outstanding, excellent science, cutting edge, a leader in his field. Okay, so already I think you're starting to see the differences here. So in the module, we talk about strategies for how to mitigate bias. So we talk about individualization, we talk about visualizing stereotypes, and then visualizing counter-stereotypes. So what might this person that you're reading about look like otherwise, and things like that. Was it successful, our unconscious gender module? Yes. Here you could see that for the next competition, 28% of applicants were female, and 29.5% went on to be successful. So again, I only have data points. I advocated strongly that we randomize this, just for the record, since I am a scientist myself, but it was considered unethical based on best practices, just so you know. So within our equity framework, we're moving towards openness and transparency. We're doing a qualitative deep dive into the comments of the reviewers and why, at least in the first competitions, there might have been differences. And we're going to render transparent some of the information about grant size and duration. And it's not public yet, but you could probably guess that women ask for shorter durations of grants and for less money than men in certain competitions. And I know I've done that. I've actually said in my head, you know what, I'll cut off half a year and I'll take off $100,000 and they'll see that I'm hardworking and that I could be cost efficient. So is that a female thing? I don't know, but possibly. Quickly about the Canada Research Chairs. So again, these are research chairs given to the universities to attract professors. Again, 70-30, the same statistics as elsewhere in Canada. But there's Tier 1 chairs, which are the most prestigious, and Tier 2, and there's a clear imbalance in the proportion of Tier 1 chairs. But even for the proportions that are submitted or nominated by the university, the success rate here is the same for the female and male applicants. So what does that tell us? Is this gender bias on the part of the reviewers? No. What's the problem? Universities are nominating more men. So here is just a question of more men being nominated. Now, this problem isn't new, and I do want to make a shout out to the 8 female professors in Canada who in 2006, as they tell me, they already had tenure, so they weren't worried, and they actually filed a suit against the Human Rights Commission in Canada to say that there is a problem and the research agencies should be held accountable for not making sure the universities nominated more women for chairs. This was a successful suit. It was actually very painful. I know a lot of the women who participated, but the Human Rights Commission of Canada established equity targets for universities in Canada for 4 disadvantaged groups, and you would think that would be a success, right? Except, who's holding them accountable, right? So it's all very nice and good, and in Canada, I'm not shaming anyone here. There's an equity target. So here's the target, the number of women, for instance, that should be nominated from each university. But year after year, here are the number who are nominated. So, you know, it depends on the size of the university. There's a way to make the pool and establish the target. Clearly, the bigger universities are doing maybe a little bit better because they have more selection, but not great, right? So when they evaluated this 10 years later, the government basically said, okay, well, hasn't been as successful as we would have liked despite the targets because you're not achieving them. So we really need to adopt greater transparency in the process for the allocation of chairs because some of the smaller universities and even some of the bigger ones say, well, I don't have the pool to select from. So then the question is, well, how are you recruiting your professors? And what exactly are your criteria? And what do you mean you've decided that there's, you know, this is the best that we can do? So this was a change that came in last year, but our fearless Minister of Science said, you know what, we've got to move faster than that. And although we saw this coming, it was only last month that she finally made the announcement that universities must create diversity plans or lose their research money. And I'm really, really proud of this. We all celebrated. Interestingly, it's called the Canadian Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Action Plan. And there was a lot of discussion about whether this should be a gender plan or if this should be a diversity and inclusion plan. And what's interesting is that some of the universities who actually are doing well with gender are not doing well on some of the other equity targets. So it doesn't just let you, rest on your laurels. You actually have to move. And I know a lot of people don't like the leaky pipe analogy. For women, it's a little bit bothersome on many levels. But the point, and this is how they show it, is to retain and increase the percent of women in higher education and research. So what did the minister say when she made this announcement? She said that there's going to be a number of requirements. One is that the public accountability needs to be posted by October 2017. So on your university website, you need to say if you have an equity committee set up at your university, what's the composition of that committee, who's on that committee, so that it's open and transparent, what's the mechanism for nominating and selecting chairs, do you adhere to best practices for recruitment and retention, and here we talk about parental leave, we talk about flexible work time and caregiving time. What does your job announcement look like? Have you studied the words in your job announcements and in the recruitment for a chair? And do you have an equity plan? And if not, you better get moving, because if by December you haven't posted your equity plan on your website and submitted it to government, then we're not going to let you submit nominations for the research chairs to your universities, which the universities don't like at all. She's giving them 2 years to meet your equity target. She wanted 6 months. Apparently there's a lot of debate here, and I could talk about the response afterwards. If not, your university will lose all its chair positions. So, tough woman, we love her. That's the story. So that was some examples of what's happening on the gender equality front in Canada. Briefly, let me tell you about the sex and gender in science. So who is being studied? Again, and I do have some handouts, we find it critical to differentiate between sex and gender, especially in health research, but even in innovation and other spheres. You know, is it are women's bodies different? That would be sex. Or is it the decision-making processes, maybe sex and gender? But very important to differentiate. And again, in the panel discussion, I'm going to talk about the importance of that language and how much it's helped me by getting people to use the right language to help them. I mean, it's so great that other scientific directors now correct each other when they misuse the word sex and gender. And I go, yes, right? Because it's a very easy way to start the culture change. So again, our policy statement, we have to be measuring this. And what we decided in 2010 is, okay, we're going to make researchers report whether they're taking sex or gender into account. And this is what the question looks like. And you're not allowed to submit a proposal for funding unless you self-report whether you're taking sex into consideration and or gender into consideration. In 2010, what do you think the baseline statistics were? So we have pillars, we look at clinical research, and we also look at biomedical or discovery research. So within the hospitals, let's say, 55% of clinical health systems and population health researchers said that they were accounting for at least one of them, good or bad. I see people saying yes, it should be almost 100%, but fine. The bad news was that only 20% of our discovery scientists said that they accounted for sex or gender. Now, I'll buy that maybe gender, if we're talking sociocultural, maybe not important, but sex should be at least 70, 80% there. Now, this is very disturbing to me. I am a practicing physician and I believe in personalized health. And I mean, there is a historical thing to this, right? So in health, we look at developing drugs, but in the 1960s, we mostly only studied male animals and included females in clinical trials because women were too complicated. We had hormones and we could get pregnant, even though I do like to point out that in real life, women get pregnant and sick women get pregnant, and you still have to treat them, right? But so there is a history to this, and people were not trained how to do it. The problem, of course, is that an audit done by the GAO in the United States showed that 8 out of 10 drugs withdrawn from the market in a certain, from 1990 to 2000 had lethal or significant side effects in women. Why? Because we didn't study or develop the drugs with female physiology. So this is problematic. Some of you may do stem cell research. Stem cell research, at least in our field, is really taking off, both for regenerative medicine, for a lot of the leukemias and cancers and cardiac stem cell therapy. Now, the stem cell, for those of you who don't know, is the progenitor cell in the body. So when the fetus is conceived, it starts with one cell, and then it develops into the rest of the body. Now, there's a reason men don't get pregnant and deliver children. What's that reason? Well, that's a complicated question. Whose stem cells do you think are actually more robust and flexible? Females. Okay, so if we're not even measuring if we're using XX or XY stem cells and who we're transplanting them into, then we're ignoring biology. So very important, mandatory reporting was a good start, but we didn't think it was enough. There's other things that need to be done. We thought that there needed to be training to try to help people change their practice. And so we've developed online training modules for science and biomedical research, data collection with humans, and data analysis from human participants. Is the training effective? Well, we've analyzed the first 1,000 completers, and you'll be happy to see maybe where your country is represented here. We don't really advertise them. They're just available on our website. And they were effective because we measured knowledge pre-post along 3 different competencies. And there's a pre-test and a post-test, and we're able to measure significant improvement. We also measure self-efficacy, which is asking the question, how confident are you that you would be able to apply a research method to differentiate sex differences in your research? So how confident are you? In Bandura's social behavioral theory, it's a good predictor of behavior change. And we found significance on all the 3 competencies. And of course, we couldn't measure their behavior change, but 90% of people who completed the module said that they were probably or most likely going to change their activity. So, what's the problem now? How do you get people to do the training? We didn't do it the best way at first. Now we've done it really well. Now we make it criteria for eligibility to apply for certain strategic programs. So this one is about developing drugs for personalized health. We said you can't apply unless you submit your certificate of completion, which you get after you finish the post-test. So that was very successful. But at first, we thought free online course should get you to do it, but we did not get the same uptake at the beginning. What we've also done historically is here's another team grant on gender, and you could see a sex and gender champion will be required. This is very similar to what the EU does in terms of their gender expert, but actually it was my male colleagues in genetics who suggested that we make the training course mandatory because they said, Cara, we don't have enough gender experts in genetics across Canada to have one of them on every single team that applies. So let's build capacity. So that's kind of interesting. Again, in the panel, I'll show you how I brought along some of my colleagues in this and how they end up coming up with better kind of ideas than we do about how to do this that are more successful because they were in the group that wasn't doing it to begin with. For peer reviewers, we haven't yet forced them to do the training module. We do give checklists, but it's hard to recruit peer reviewers, and it's felt by the organization that adding another burden it's not the right time to do it in Canada. So is it working? This is interesting. So this is our investigator-initiated competitions. These actually aren't the competitions for the strategic ones where we made it mandatory, but it's all the same people, right? It's all the same people. And so we're starting to see a crossover here in the last few years and in red about who's reporting that they take sex into account. And again, we targeted the discovery community. Then we're going to work on the other community next. But I think this shows that it's effective. I'll end by saying the science ecosystem is complex. I talked a little bit about the levers on universities with the chairs. I talked a little bit about the training for the researchers. We are trying to get rid of gender bias in peer review in our funding organization. But I didn't talk about the research ethics boards, who now we're targeting because they really say, so are you going to be able to recruit men and women? How are you doing that? Let me see your announcements. And perhaps most importantly, it's really the journal and science editors who hold the key for what gets published in the main literature and becomes basic knowledge. So I'll end with a shout out to the Sex and Gender Equity and Research Guidelines. Is everyone who's not aware of the SAGER guidelines here? You all know what they are? So these are guidelines put out by the European Association of Science Editors. We're a member of the Gender Policy Committee. They're included in the Equator Network. That's an acronym for Enhancing the Quality and Transparency of Research. You should, please can, if you haven't already, endorse the guidelines here. And what they say, we're trying to get journals to endorse them. So in medicine, The Lancet is one that does. It says, editors should not even be sending the papers out for peer review unless A, they use the term sex and gender correctly, B, they've actually disaggregated the data by sex or taken it into consideration and gender where appropriate, and they actually show the magnitude of effect when women and men are being considered. So I think this is going to be huge for moving the field forward. My take-home messages are that research funding agencies can be key levers of change, able to apply pressure on universities, but also on investigators themselves. But it won't work if you don't have training and accountability measures in place. Let's make science equal, but let's also ensure there are equal benefits for all. Thank you.